In this video, I'm going to talk about using machines to help you mix your dough. So there are some different kinds of machines you can use. Here I have sort of a classic countertop mixer. This one comes with a few different attachments. So the old style bread hook was sort of a C-shaped hook and didn't really do a super great job at kneading. So more recently they have introduced this attachment. It is a spiral and it mimics what the giant mixers in bakeries use. So if you're buying one, make sure you get this attachment. If you have an old mixer, you might be able to find this attachment that will fit with the machine you have. The other attachment you might use is the paddle. This is helpful with very wet doughs like a ciabatta, or I use it with when I make sprouted wheat bread, because that dough starts out kind of wet and floppy, although it does sort of come together and stiffen later in the process. If you don't have one of these mixers and don't want to invest in one, there are some other things you can do. So for example, if you have a food processor, you can actually use that to knead dough using the blades. I know that seems kind of strange, and I wouldn't really believe it, except I've seen it work. Mix up your ingredients into the dough and then put it in the food processor, and the chopping just somehow needs it. The one thing that was a little weird was it got very, very hot, and so midway through the process we actually had to take it out and put it in the freezer for a few minutes to cool it down, and then continue kneading. But it made a viable dough. If you have a bread machine, you want to make artisan bread and do most of the process by hand, you can use your bread machine to do the kneading part of the process and then take the dough out and do the rest by hand. The basic process when using a machine is pretty much the same, in that you can still mix up your dough, have that auto-lease or rest period, then add the salt, and then do your kneading. One main thing about using a mixer is that it adds some friction to the mixing, and that adds heat to your dough. This is especially true if you're making a grainy dough, like a whole wheat or a multi-grain bread. So to combat this, you would use colder water. And, I would maybe start with maybe 55 degrees and see how that turns out, because it depends on the temperature of your house and your ingredient temperatures and how long you're going to mix for. So I would just start with a cool temperature and then take your final dough temperature and adjust accordingly. A common question is how long to mix for. And again, that is going to depend on the mixer you have, the recipe you're making, and then how much dough is in there, and just different factors in your kitchen. So maybe start with 5 minutes and then stop your mixer, do a window test, see how your dough is doing, and then, do another few minutes if it needs more, and just keep doing those increments and stopping and checking it until you have a good value to use for that recipe and your mixer. So one thing to think about is if you have a good amount of dough in the bowl and the mixer is sort of catching the dough and kneading the whole thing continuously, it will get kneaded a little bit faster. But if you only have a little bit of dough in the bowl and the mixer is, hitting part of it, but not really hitting the whole thing, it's going to take longer for that whole amount of dough to be kneaded. So for example, in the demonstration that I recorded and is coming up, I actually ended up kneading, I think, for 20 or 25 minutes. Another question is what mixer speed to use. So when you first put your ingredients in the bowl, start with the slowest speed, because if you go too fast, it will fling flour out of the bowl and get it everywhere. You could also mix up your ingredients in a bowl by hand, and then once you have a bunch of dough, put that in the mixer. As far as once you start kneading, there are some different opinions on this. I personally kind of like to emulate hand kneading, so I just want like a slow, steady speed that is what my hands would be doing if I were doing it by hand. Some people like a higher speed or like a mix of low and high, and they have all different opinions on what this does to the dough and why it's better. When I got this mixer, the instructions said do not knead dough at higher than 2, so I need it on tube because I don't want to wear out the little engine of my mixer. But so the main problem with a mixer is when it can't reach all of the ingredients or dough in the bowl and it can't do a good job mixing. So when you first start and you have your flour and your water, even if you have a good amount of ingredients in there, the mixer will often not be able to catch what's at the very bottom of the bowl. And so you'll see it start to make a dough, but there will be a whole bunch of flour that's down there at the bottom. And you just need to stop the mixer, take your scraper, scrape down the walls of the bowl, and even like get under there and flip all that dry stuff up into the wet stuff, and then start it again, and eventually the dough will come together. Or, as I mentioned before, you can mix all the ingredients up by hand and then put them in your mixer. So once you have your dough, it's in the bowl, and if it looks like it's not really being kneaded, sometimes that's because you have this big bowl and just a little bit of dough, and the mixer can't really reach the dough. So a solution there would be to double your recipe. Make twice as much to fill the bowl. That'll help it get kneaded, and then after the dough is kneaded, you can split it in half, and you can bake with half of it and then just store the other half to use later. So sometimes even if you have a full bowl, like if you have that old C-shaped dough hook, the dough just gets stuck on it and it isn't really being kneaded. And the best solution there, I think, is to just stop periodically and scrape the dough off the hook and then start again. I've seen people try all kinds of other stuff like oiling the hook or wetting the hook or using a high speed to fling the dough off the hook. And I've really never seen one of those methods work very well. So I think scraping is the best bet. And then finally, if you're not quite sure if your dough is being mixed, so say you think the dough hook is picking it up, but you're not really sure, you can do a really simple test where you take an ingredient like dried basil, something that's visible but pretty small, and just drop a bunch of it in one side of the bowl and then watch and see what happens. Does it stick to the dough and just keep going around in the same spot, or does it get kneaded all throughout the dough until it's evenly distributed? If it's the latter, you know your mixer is working and it is kneading the whole ball of dough. But if it just stays in one spot, then the mixer isn't really kneading, it's just moving the dough around in a circle. I'll just end with some footage I took a few days ago of me kneading a loaf of bread in my mixer. idea is you try to stretch it so that it's thin enough that light can come through it without ripping. So you can see as I start stretching this one, it's not totally smooth. There's some blotchiness to it, and before I can get it super thin, it starts ripping. So we're getting there, but we don't quite have a window yet. It's not the perfect window, but it's pretty good. And it's been kneading a long time, so I think we're gonna call it quits.